We're actually starting a new series this week. We were on our last series for actually 6 weeks. I don't know if it feels like it, but it's quite a while. And so we're starting a new one this week. But before we get into it, just want to offer a quick reminder that this Sunday, September 13th, we're actually having our in-person youth group meeting from 6:30 to 7:30 here on the church patio. So we're going to be outside going through our lesson. I would suggest that you have a mask on hand, just in case, even though we should be rather distant anyway. And maybe we'll have some fun activity, and also maybe we'll even share what's going on in all of our lives a little bit, and then really just dive into a lesson. Now, if you can make it in person, great, awesome. And if you can't quite do that yet, then just watch this lesson, and still stay connected to what's going on, and still be a part of the youth ministry here. The other thing is, if you want to look really smart and know your stuff, watch it this morning and then come this evening and really contribute to the conversation. But either way, or in any case, I just want to encourage you to make it if you can, and if not, then we hope to see you soon. And as I said, we are starting a new series. It's called King of Hearts. And what I really like and appreciate about this series that we're trying to get into is we're going to focus on this kind of captivating story of King Saul from the Old Testament, and kind of using his story, Saul's, to show us what it means to really kind of, follow Jesus more. We're going to kind of take his circumstances, his decisions, both good and bad, and see how that kind of reflects on we today who follow Christ, and how he can be actually king of our hearts, in an actual day-to-day life, or in a day-to-day example. And so today's lesson, actually, week 1, who is king? And that's the question we're asking today. Who is king? And we're going to be using 1 Samuel 12, and really the whole chapter, but we're kind of pulling a lot of the stuff that we're talking about from verse 24. So I think a good place to start, really a good question to ask, is how familiar are you with King Saul of the Old Testament? Maybe you know him as the king before David. Maybe you know him from trying to throw a bunch of spears at David. Either way, and again, I don't want to give any spoilers away, but or it's really not a spoiler if you just read it all. So there's that. But however you remember Saul, if you know him or remember him at all, and if you're not familiar with that, that's obviously okay. But that's what this whole lesson, this whole series is going to try and shed some light on about him. And again, we're not going to necessarily look at all the negative things. There's certainly plenty of that to look at. But we want to just simply look at his life and his decisions, and how he even became, how did he even become king? Because Saul is a great character study, because there's so much about him in the Old Testament. Believe it or not, there is more to his story. I mean, yes, there's the David stuff, and his interactions with David, but there's things before that we can and probably really should take note of in the Old Testament. Because through his experiences, and really, when we say his experience as king over Israel, right? So we're really also talking about Israel as well, the nation. We can actually see a lot of parallels to our own life and struggles in faith through Saul, through Israel. And again, I know we've looked at Israel quite a bit in the last couple of series, and there's a reason for that, because really, what happens or transpires or takes place in the Old Testament is what leads into the New Testament. And what happens at the start of the New Testament, we are revealed that Jesus is the Christ, right? He is the Messiah. So really, the Old Testament leads up to the presence and the need for Christ to come. And so by understanding basically the past, we understand what happens more when Jesus, and why Jesus comes when he does. So that's why this understanding, this exposure to the Old Testament, and people like Saul really help us to see how we can better follow Christ. So some backstory, maybe a quick recap. Why Israel? Why Saul as king? So again, after the garden, after the flood, God, promised. He said, "I'm not going to just wipe the slate clean anymore. No reboots like that. I will redeem the people from kind of within, rather than just wiping them out. I'll kind of from the ground up, I'll redeem them, and I'll save them from this like sinful state, this sinful nature. And the way he did that, he wanted to pick probably one of the lowliest, most underappreciated, unnoticed groups of people, the Israelites, or at the time the Hebrews, and bring light through to this dark world, bring redemption, a redeemer, and ultimately, as we know, Jesus came through, or came out of this people group, and the fact that Jesus would come from Israel makes them a very unique group. However, that uniqueness doesn't just stop with Jesus. There's more to it, and of course, Jesus is probably one of the, if not the major focus. But I think it doesn't tell the whole story because there's so much more to this idea that God would choose Israel. Israel is unique in the Old Testament because they're actually ruled by God. That's the circumstance. That's the situation that God set up even back with Abraham. I will be your God, and you will be my people. And we look at that and say, well, of course, God's choosing. He wants to be their God, and they want to have that faithful bond with one another. But God is saying more than that too, because God wants to be the king, so to speak, not a ruler like Saul, but God wants to be king of their hearts and minds as well as their nation. So that's kind of what God is trying to set up, is that he will kind of lead them in a manner of speaking, or not just figuratively, but also literally. Now, it should be said that this is a strong contrast to the people groups that lived around Israel at the time. They followed gods, idols, out of sticks, rocks, mud, animal skin even. And what we're really saying here is that basically any idol worship or pagan worship was not off limits to all the people that surrounded Israel. And so that's also what set Israel apart. And God did incredible things through Israel. Remember, before God chose them as his people, they were very lowly people, but yet God, through him, I should say, God did incredible things and really put Israel, the nation of Israel, on the map, and it made them a real force, a real presence in the ancient world. And in turn, Israel made God famous. They promoted, they showed that God was their leader. God was everything to them, and that's what they presented to the world. And this should sound familiar, because as followers of Jesus, we are made to be saved and unique in our world today. That's the same idea that we should be taking up for ourselves. Now, rather than worship the gods in our world today, the idols, really, when I say gods in this case, it's really idols, made out of metal, phones, leather, sports, paper, money, fabric, clothes, and such. Other idols of such a popularity, romance, security, etc. We are made and saved by God to work in our world, and he wants to work through us as well. He's asking us to do the same things that the Israelites had done and should have kept on doing. Now, of course, we have a very different culture than the ancient Hebrews or Israelites, but we have common principles. Yet, with common principles, also comes like common problems. So, what is the problem that we're trying to address today? Well, the problem that we face and that Israel faced as well was we'd rather worship what we see rather than what we believe. And that's really what we're addressing today. We'd rather worship what we see, or the world around us, the things in the world around us, than what we claim to believe. Israel, much like in some senses that we are today, Israel was surrounded by other nations who had other gods, idols. Other nations had human beings who served as their kings and rulers rather than God, right? So this was the whole thing that God was trying to avoid, is having some corruptible, imperfect person leading everything. That's the system God wanted to avoid. And so he set up something different. And we're going to talk about that because Israel could only go so long. Again, that human nature, that sinful nature. Israel would only go so long before they saw what other people had or what other people were doing. So eventually Israel did want a king. And there was a reason for that. They had reasons. Sometimes we all do. But I think it's very important right now to really just talk about what is Israel's leadership structure? What did God really try to set up? So let's talk about that. In the Old Testament, the people of Israel would hear from God through prophets, which is funny because we just got through talking about minor prophets, right? During this time of like 1 Samuel that we're talking about, during this time that we're pulling this information from 1 Samuel 12, we read the prophet at the time was Samuel. Now, Samuel is also a great person we could spend a lot of time talking about, but essentially Samuel was the voice of God. There was no Bible. There was no, hey, let's kind of get our 20 minutes of reading in, some prayer time. That wasn't how things operated then. The voice of God basically came through Samuel. So, in other words, if you wanted to hear what God thought about a question or something that you thought and wondered about, you would go and talk to or ask Samuel, who would in turn tell you what God was saying. For a time, maybe actually for a while, the people of Israel were fine with this system. It worked for them. And again, that's what really kind of helped make them such a presence at the time. However, like human nature, at some point, they began to want, again, all the other stuff that was around them. As the phrase goes, like the grass is always greener, right, on the other side. So, however, it's also probably true that Samuel was getting older, and Samuel's two sons were probably not the type of people you wanted to be the voice of God. Not a good situation there. So people were looking at this and being like, yeah, Samuel's great, but what comes after that? So this was, I think, a legitimate worry that the Israelites had. We could maybe say something akin to that, in our own nation, our own culture, where we have a leader, depending on where you want to put them in your life. I wouldn't necessarily say politics, but you may have someone who's a really influential leader, and then they leave or perhaps pass away or whatever. And the question always is, well, we'll never have that again. Or the worry is that we'll never have that again, so let's just go with whatever, and that becomes the concern. But again, there's the flaw there, because rather than trust that God will bring exactly what is needed or the person that is needed after the Samuel, it's impossible for God to bring a new Samuel. Eventually, Israel just jumps to this idea of, well, let's just have a king. He'll rule us and tell us what to do. Won't that be great? Rather than God doing it and going into that system that God was trying to avoid, basically Israel just wants to jump right in. And the problem here is that not what the people were asking for, it's more of the reason the people were asking for it. They want to basically have what everyone else around them has, and they think, well, it works for them, so let's have it work for us. And therein lies, again, the problem. Sometimes, and again, there's probably very many points in the Bible where the worst thing you can have happen to you is God actually answers or gives you exactly what you think you're asking for, and or what you want, and God gives it to you. In fact, God even shares, like, I'm going to give you exactly what you want and more than enough of it. So, and again, there's really good examples all throughout the Bible where God warns us that He'll do that. And, it's not just too much of a good thing. In fact, more often we see it as not a good thing that there's too much of. It's usually more of the wrong thing and a lot of it. So, I think, as an aside here, maybe we should all ask ourselves, myself included, have you ever asked for something that we see now as dumb, and you look back on it and think, boy, I was praying for the wrong thing? Now, you don't have to answer that to me, but I think maybe be honest with yourself for a moment and wonder that to yourself. Have I ever asked for something way not the right thing? And have you regretted it? So keep that in mind, because I think this is where Israel's at. And that's where we finally have enter Saul, right? And the story of Saul becoming king is interesting. I think if you kind of read it, and you can find that in 1 Samuel chapters 9 and 10, basically Saul is he's going about his business. He's trying to look for some lost donkeys, bumps into Samuel, bing bang boom, Saul becomes king. So God has Samuel anoint Saul. And that's when you boil it down, that's pretty much what happened. But God did warn them, as God does. He gives them the desire for a king, but their desire, he meets that, but this also kind of hurts God in that, it doesn't wound him, but it kind of saddens God, much like sin does. It saddens God because, again, he had the system there, and the people became, selfish. Again, that sinful rebellion. And this kind of wounds God in that way, that God knows things will not be the way he desired them to be. And he warns them, actually, in 1 Samuel 8:11 through 17. And I'll paraphrase. Basically, God is saying that, and he reveals that a king will basically take part of your land, maybe most of your land. He'll take your crops. He'll take your money and taxes. He'll take your food. He'll use them as he wants. He'll take your sons and your daughters, even your own servants. If you have servants at that time, they're his. He's going to put your sons in the armory or in the field. He'll take your daughter, make him work in his kitchen or in his palace. And on and on. God warns that this is what a king does. And of course, he is right. God is absolutely right. Saul does this and more, as every other king beyond him does, and all the other kings in the nations around him. This is what they do. And but it's fair to say that the people do quickly fall in love with Saul at first. It's a very interesting thing because, again, he's a tall guy. Some say he was like a head taller than anyone else in Israel. He's strong. He has that leadership presence. He turns out to be a heck of a military guy, strategist, and some of his exploits were well known. And so the people do love Saul for a time. Again, they think they've got what they asked for, and then some, right? And when I say for a time they loved him, this was a long while, but eventually Saul kind of believed some of his own hype. And from there, I don't want to get too far ahead to other lessons, but it kind of eventually goes really bad really quick. So, but it's fair to say too, Samuel refuses to, kind of just go riding off into the sunset without one more speech. And why not? Because Samuel's whole life was speaking to the people. And so his kind of last ditch effort is to share really something from his own heart. I truly don't think, as you hear some of this, that Samuel is speaking on behalf of God, but I think he's giving a plea to the people to return to God. And who probably knows better than Samuel, because he reminds the people, how good God has been to them, how he has brought them victory after victory, and how he's even rescued and pulled the people, the nation, really through all of these difficulties and trials. And as Samuel gives his speech, he even brings down some sort of thunder on command. Think about how powerful that would be as he's speaking, and this rumbling, the shaking. After that, the Israelites recognize that they've made this huge mistake immediately, and the people actually beg for forgiveness and ask God not to kill them. This is Samuel's response. This is 1 Samuel, again, chapter 12. We're going to look at verses 20 and 21, and then jump to 24 and 25. And this is in the NIV. Do not be afraid. You have done all this evil. Yet do not turn away from the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. Do not turn away after useless idols. They can do no good, nor can they rescue you because they are useless. But be sure to fear the Lord and serve him faithfully. With all your heart, consider what great things he has done for you. So, there's a graciousness there. Samuel doesn't shy away from pointing out what was wrong in the situation. And yet, still he follows it up with this call to action. So I think what we see here is that even in our bad decisions, God is gracious. And it's never too late to give God basically our hearts. And I know that may sound cheesy or trite, but really that's what God was trying to always set up. He wants to dwell in here in all of us, and as we commune together, as we build a community together of like-minded, like-hearted, Christ within us, then what could we not do, right? So I think that's the thing. But to be fair and to be sure, Israel made some bad decisions. Saul, we will see, makes bad decisions. And you and I make bad decisions. And so we're going to continue to make bad decisions. And God isn't asking God isn't asking for perfection. We've said it before in these lessons that he's not looking for perfection. He's basically asking for our heart. He wants that relationship. He wants that bond with us. So I think we need to remember that. And if you're struggling with are you putting things is there something else that you're putting before God? And sometimes we may not even be aware of it. In this time of COVID and everything, and being away from church or youth group or something like that, it's easy to fall into a new kind of rut, a new kind of way of doing things, a new way of just something drawing your attention away. And at first it seems fine. I think the enemy often uses things that are good to draw us away, and yet we don't always recognize it. We're kind of led to believe it's just all still good. But the point is that if you're struggling with that today, or you're not even sure if you're struggling with it, I would just say take the time now. Be in prayer. Be in God's Word. Look at Saul and see what happened in that situation, and see how that reflects upon you and I in our own relationship with God. And so I would just encourage you to do that as always. And if you get a chance, again, just be in the Word, read it, and see how it just affects you and what you can take away from it. And with that, I hope you have a wonderful and blessed day, and we'll talk to you later. Bye.